The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Greencrest's periodic webinar series. Glad you could join us for a very topical session, especially given the earnings season is in full swing. I'm Santosh Rao, Head of Research here at Greencrest Capital. I will introduce the topic today and lead the session. Before we do that, today's topic is on Spotify, dominant in Tunes 2.0. As most streaming companies, Spotify gets mixed reviews depending on which side of the divide you stand in. Listeners love it, most of them do. Artists, not so much. Meanwhile, Spotify continues to grow and has established itself as a premier site for music listening. Today is my distinguished colleague, Max Wolf. He's our senior analyst and chief economist. Today's format is short and crisp, as always, 20 minutes of presentation and 10 minutes for Q&A. With that, let me get started. Max and I will take turns during the presentation, and I will start the presentation. So let's go to slide 2, which is a disclaimer. And please read that at your convenience. It's just the general disclaimer. Slide 3 is just the overview. Today's presenters are me and Max, like I said before. The topics are the framework for today's discussion, industry overview, deep dive into Spotify, winners and losers in the business, and then finally Q&A. So that's the setup for today. And with that, I'm going to let Max set the stage for today's presentation with the framework.
Thank you for joining us. Our hope today is to bring you through a kind of whirlwind tour of the context for and also the story around Spotify. In order to do that, we need to talk about the pivot underway in the music consumption space, and that's a pivot from really the older forms of music consumption, whether those were live venues, terrestrial radio, or the MP3 format, probably most famously dominated by Apple with the iPod and also with the iTunes offerings, into the disruptive new space that's really been emerging now for about 10 years, but has begun to take off in terms of revenue, in terms of share of the industry, in terms of mind share, public attention, and has really been catapulted into a much more rapid growth context by the rise of social and the rise of mobile. We see Spotify as both a leader in the space and also an illustrative case study. So just to give you a little background so you understand the context, we're here talking about the pivot to digital and the pivot to mobile in mass music consumption. The music business, particularly in its traditional form, peaked in about 1999 with just shy of $30 billion in revenue. To give you an idea of how tough a decade or a little bit more than a decade this industry has had, the 2011 revenue is about $16 billion. So you're looking at almost a 50% decline over approximately a 10-year period. And I think, as most folks know, it has not been a particularly great time for the recording space. What we're excited about here, we see a little bit of a second wind or second coming here for the music space, which we believe is on the cusp of figuring out how to monetize the movement away from the traditional consumption patterns into Web 2.0 consumption patterns. So we're pretty excited about that. We think the music industry is as well. We think Spotify is a test case that really shows the strengths, the weaknesses, and gives us a look around the corner to the future of the space. Clearly, streaming music products, what we're mostly talking about today, don't have the highest of barriers to entry. It's not terribly difficult to get into the industry so long as you're able to cut a bunch of agreements, contractual relationships with the owners of the catalogs. More on that later. And then basically you're harnessing either the web traditionally or more likely the mobile carrier space and wireless space to deliver as your basic pipeline the way radio stations once did or concert venues, etc. So the barriers to entry are an issue. However, it is expensive. And one of the key things to keep in mind that we'll be returning to as a thematic across today's discussion is when you do the licensure deals, which are required by the music industry, you are guaranteed to have to pay every time you play the song. You are not guaranteed to get paid every time you stream the song. And this is the reason we feel that this space has been quite disruptive, but also disrupted, and the special sauce to go to profit has been fairly elusive. You're guaranteed to have to pay to stream the songs. You're not guaranteed to be paid by a public quite acclimatized to freemium business models, which are a bit treacherous in this particular space. We see this sort of beginning here of the disruption a little bit more than 10, 12, 13 years ago with iTunes and Napster shaking up the old method, the Web 1.0 shakeup, if you will, giving way to the new crop, which are just beginning to sort of emerge. So Pandora, founded in 2000, 13-year-old story there. Rhapsody, 2001. Spotify, our focus piece for today, founded in 2006, so 7-year-old company. We see a pivot to digital, long, slow, and difficult to translate into profit, beginning the better part of 13 years ago and hitting a sort of hyperdrive, an inflection point in 2011, which is exactly the same time that we see the digital beginning to resuscitate the music industry as it figures out, as we figure out a way to again generate meaningful profit from the space. Licensing and royalty issues will continue to be an issue. Most of today will take you through Spotify, and I'll leave most of that in the capable hands of Santosh Rao, and I'll be doing more of the contextual on this sum up. Looking at the industry, the context for our discussion today, that's slide 5. Again, looking at the global music industry and sales. So again, the peak being a little bit more than 13, 14 years ago, and the present being about half of that. If you look at the chart to your right, you can keep in mind that the blue is the digital, the red is the traditional. Right? Keep in mind here, obviously, if you're not looking at a color screen, this will be a little confusing, but the upper portion is blue and is digital, the lower portion is red and is traditional. There's monotonic decline in the older ways of distributing music and monotonic growth, consistent growth in the newer format, the digital. We see 2011 as an inflection point, and we see digital as the future. So much as we've watched the publishing industry, we've watched the magazine industry, the news industry struggle with a pivot to profitability in digital, we're watching that in the music industry. Only few analysts seem to have figured this out and really made a conscious bet on the space or understood what's happening. So digital revenue is now over 35% of the business, and it's a sizable 5 plus, almost $6 billion this year, over $6 billion in 2013. And what's emerging is a subscriber model. You see that from Google, you see that from Spotify, you see that from Pandora. So a freemium kind of subscription model. Some basic access with advertising support, and then an upsell to a higher quality, less ad-interfered streaming experience. And Pandora has been the leader and has been the most successful to date in two very, very key regards. One, getting the free user to become a paid user, obviously the existential struggle for anyone in the freemium space. And then more importantly, getting a very high rate of conversion. So today at Spotify, almost 25% of the user base is paying. That's very, very high in the freemium business model and speaks to their ability to make revenue significantly, north of $600 million in our estimation for 2013 from subscriptions, as well as supplementing that with the advertising model that has proved fairly difficult in the streaming music space. Strong subscriber growth continues to be true across the space, but the royalty fees are quite significant, and what we've seen is a crowded space emerge. So Apple entering the space, Google in the space, Amazon in the space, Jimmy Iovine and some of the folks over at Beat announcing last week that they're entering the space. The low barriers to entry, the excitement of the general public, the rising usership has led a lot of folks into the space. This has been good news for the owners of the catalogs, but it has also meant that there's significant pressure, and it's not very easy to push down the streaming price. So the prices are staying fairly elevated, and while there's a lot of user interest, translating user interest into dollars has proved as difficult here in the pivot to mobile and the pivot to freemium as it has in every other place we've studied that transition across its various moments. The artists and labels continue to be at each other's throat. I think this particular story is as old as Methuselah, but nothing that's happened in the digital streaming space has done anything to alleviate the pressure between content creators and content owners. So the way streaming music is being articulated, the crowdedness of the field, the difficulty in converting to revenue, has created a situation that's quite good for the labels and the owners of the content, but has left the artists, and this is hardly a new story, perennially grumbling and feeling left behind by the way the music industry has begun to rebuild from the long slide starting in the late 90s, and has done so more or less without a large revenue share composition for the creative artists. We believe this will continue to be a bit of an issue, even with some legislation being proposed as an effort to claw that back. I'm just going to go to slide 6 here and give you a little bit of an overview of the landscape. As you move from left to right, on demand to non-interactive to download, it's actually the chronological reverse. So we see the cutting edge, the Web 2.0, as that column all the way on the left, on demand. We see the sort of bridge technologies in the middle, largely here, non-interactive video, and that on the far right, the downloads, that's really the Web 1.0, which was dominated very much by the iPod and by iTunes, which we do see as under heavy pressure, and we do see that from the Apple quarterly reports, as people pivot to a mobile and streaming experience. Getting folks to buy and store music has been a little bit more challenging, although Apple and Amazon continue to dominate that space. Obviously, in the non-interactive radio space, here what we're looking at are competitors. Many of these have articulated partnerships with major automakers, Volvo, Ford, Honda, etc., and are providing a content that's fairly similar to terrestrial radio. They're just doing it through the internet. So the first move was download the music in digital format. The next move was replicate through internet distribution more or less something akin to the kind of experience that you might have had historically in terrestrial radio, only no longer through terrestrial radio. And here Pandora is both a large leader in the space, first to the public market, and really has an algorithmic-based setup that's been tweaked and refined over the last decade plus, and they really do belong in both categories here, both the non-interactive and the on-demand. And you'll see Spotify is also in both categories. We fully expect the on-demand category to grow with Apple's imminent offering and with the new offering from Beats and Jimmy Iovine and some other names. Certainly, we could have made a very long column there, but we're kind of looking at the most relevant competition for Spotify across today and the major players in this space. So this gives you an idea of the competitive landscape that Spotify is playing in. And of course, you'll see some names that one would only dismiss as competitors with great trepidation. Obviously, Google's in the space, the Google Play, which you'll see as the fourth or the third from the bottom. You see that Apple is widely rumored to be coming in. They seem to be poised to have an offering very similar to the offering folks associate with Pandora. That leads me to my last major point before I turn it back to Santosh. Part of what's happening in streaming music, which we think is quite important and is another thematic for further conversation on a different webinar, is that various providers of mobile operating systems, since music consumption is becoming a mobile story, the different operators want to enclose the ecosystem. Google has its offering, Apple has its offering, Amazon is coming with an offering, and we fully expect this to continue because as Facebook and Spotify have taught us with their partnership, music is social, music is mobile, and you don't want people to have to leave your ecosystem, if you're Apple, if you're Facebook, if you're Google, in order to spend the time and have the social and mobile interactions which people tend to do around music. So it's good to keep in mind that we see the ecosystem providers like Google and Apple in the mobile space as major future players and contours of the realities of streaming music. With that, I'm going to let Santosh take you through subscription services taking hold.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for laying the overview here. I think the next slide, slide number 7, is a good lead into Spotify's, before we go deeper into Spotify. Subscription is Spotify's core business, and the next 3 points can illustrate the fact that that is hold. It's now become an integral part of the recorded music market with 20 million paying subscribers globally in 2012, and that's up 44% year over year. And more specifically, I think as you can see from the chart below, it's particularly strong in Europe and Korea, and US is picking up. More than that, the subscription services revenue have crossed the 10% mark as a total share of the total music business for the first time. And that's the total digital music revenues for the first time in 2012. And this is considerably higher in Europe at about 20%, fueled by the explosive growth in Scandinavia. The third point is the whole growth is being driven by multiple factors. Specifically, it's more successful bundling of deals with ISPs and mobile operators. It's an improved user experience, integration with social networks, and a greater variety of price points. So all these points are really driving the subscription services business, and which is particularly good for Spotify. So going on to the next slide, slide 8, this is diving deeper into Spotify. Just kind of briefly, this Spotify is a music streaming service that features both on-demand and non-interactive services. But Pandora is the undisputed leader in the non-interactive services. They're almost the poster child for streaming business. They've been around the longest, since 2000. But Spotify is more the streaming side. On the on-demand side, it competes in the music category commonly referred to as internet radio. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, subscription is the largest source of digital music in Europe, and in some countries, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, it's the largest. And the company, Spotify, has access to over 12 million audio tracks and boasts that it would take a user 80 years of non-stop listening to go through the entire catalog. And as of March 2013, Spotify had 24 million active users and 6 million paying subscribers, and has raised 280 million in funding to date. The 6 million paying subscribers is as of March, like I mentioned, and we expect that to grow, and I'll go into that more detail later on. Just below, before we go to the next slide, you can see that Spotify is available on multiple platforms. It's on mobile, which is very important at this stage in any business, desktops, and its particular relationship with Facebook, which has been very helpful for Spotify, and we'll go over that in more detail a little later. Just before I go into the bull and bear cases for Spotify, I'll just let Max go over the broader investment thesis on Spotify, and then I'll come back.
Thank you. I think we'd like to note here that we are optimistic both on the space writ large and particularly on the name Spotify. We do see a situation where we're still 2 to 3 years minimum away from profitability. This has to do with reaching a scale that's sufficient and also converting along that scale with a ramp up in conversion from free to subscription and keeping the ad revenue up. This has been a challenge, keeping the ad revenue up. We believe this challenge will continue and possibly get more severe going forward. However, we believe that is fairly good for Spotify, as their reliance on advertising is slightly less than many of their core competitors, because they're heavily complemented. The vast majority of their revenue comes from the subscription base. That's important. We see the platform of the future, really already the platform of the present, as increasingly a mobile platform, and monetizing ads served on the mobile platform is very difficult. Another thing to keep in mind is that the advertisers have slowly wised up. This has caused some difficulty at Pandora, among other names. And the understanding is that folks are now normally streaming on a mobile device, and they are not looking at the screen. And that creates a situation which we're seeing Spotify, particularly Pandora as well, begin to turn to their advantage. Early on, it was highly disadvantageous. Advertisers slashed what they would pay as the user base, particularly again for Pandora, moved from desktop and notebook computers to tablets and mostly smartphones. The revenue generated per ad fell by more than 50% in most cases, in some cases falling by 75%. And so you had to go from visual advertising, which basically the advertisers and the product producers there would not pay for anymore, to audio. Turned out that while that was intrusive to the experience, it also helped to jack up the convert rate from free to paid, and that's been very good. Probably the most artful version of that has come out of Spotify. Again, Santosh mentioned its roots in Scandinavia. Its very successful rollout in the UK and the United States. And in the United States, the success of mobile and social, particularly along the lines of Facebook, has been indispensable and core to the Spotify story. Spotify was able to ramp up incredibly quickly and really have viral adoption in the United States, largely because of its close and very good relationship leveraged off the Facebook relationship. We would be cautious there too, hence the cautious optimism. The space has low barriers to entry. It is quite competitive. The giants of tech, Google, Apple, etc., are in this space and or are coming. And we still have a situation where what you have to pay to stream is a fixed cost, and how well you can monetize against that, largely through subscriptions, somehow or often usually coupled with some advertising, is still difficult. Therefore, we are optimistic. However, we do not see a robust profitability for Spotify in anything less than 18 months at the absolute soonest. So we would label ourselves cautiously optimistic, and we're introducing a value metric here. You'll see in the third slide here on number 9, third bullet point here on slide number 9, that we've adopted a fairly low multiple as against some other folks in this space. And we do think that that multiple will bend up as more meaningful EBITDA positive experience comes along, so long as Spotify can continue its close relationship with Facebook, continue to be able to convert free to paid, and continue to be a dominant choice for social and mobile, which it's leveraged to, and which we believe are enduring secular themes going nowhere soon. With that, I'm delighted to turn it back to Santosh, who will take you through the bull and bear case.
Thanks, Max. The next slide, slide 10, kind of summarizes the bull and bear cases for Spotify. We've mentioned quite a few points earlier, but I thought this was a good place to summarize what we think are the bull and the bear cases. Starting off with the bull case, demand for digital music is in a strong secular uptrend. Like we mentioned earlier, roughly 52% of total sales now, especially in 2011, was from digital music. And so that's expected to grow with multiple devices and with better streaming technologies and all that. So I think the demand is just going to trend up. The second point is Spotify has excellent partnerships with major music labels and is forging new alliances with car manufacturers and other verticals. So that should not only help in terms of royalty negotiations down the road, but also in terms of advertising revenue down the road as well. So that's an important piece that Spotify is working on. The third part is the network effect from deep social layer that the company has developed over time. So this, its relationship with Facebook is particularly important. In fact, that relationship helped Spotify launch in the U.S. And it's really, I mean, the streaming business is inherently social. And I think to tie up with Facebook is nothing but a good move on the part of Spotify. The next point is the subscription service uptake is strong, particularly in Europe. It's 20% of sales, and it's growing. So Spotify has a good base there, and it's introducing new kind of initiatives out there, and it's growing its base. So that should help down the road in terms of scale and just kind of building up the critical mass. The next point is that the artists are beginning to understand the economics of subscription model. There was a lot of misconception that they're not getting paid, but on the face of it, it sounds like they are not. But talking to a few people and doing some channel checks, we found that the artists are coming around slowly and beginning to accept the subscription model more and more, as opposed to just getting paid one-off. And finally, on the bull case, we think advertising should be a meaningful contributor for Spotify down the road. Right now, we estimate it's about 20 to 25% of total revs. but it should ramp up as the company forges new alliances and the subscriber base and the listening hours get bigger and bigger. On the bear side, of course, the unfavorable economics of royalty payments, they're really clouding the profitability, the road to profitability, like I put it. From some estimates that we've come across, 70% of all receipts the company pays out in royalties and licensing. So that's a big chunk of their money coming in, and they need to renegotiate that thing down the road. And the company seems to be moving in that direction. Talking to a few people, we found out that they are making progress in terms of in the renegotiation, but it's a touchy topic and it's going to take a while, but they're definitely on that track. The second point is that this business has low barriers to entry, like we mentioned earlier, and the offerings are pretty much undifferentiated across the board. Everyone has the same price points. The collection is vast. You can access it any which way. The key is going to be the service offering, how you service it, and kind of just pretty much a land grab, get the people, get the subscriber base, get the critical mass, and offer good service, and have a deep social layer so you can have a stickiness out there so you can keep the listeners on board. The third point is, of course, like Max mentioned, Google All Access is in there. Apple is planning to be there. Amazon, I'm sure, will come down the road. So the competition is heating up, and so as of now, I think Spotify has established itself. It has the relationships, but it has to be wary of these big giants out there coming in their space. So we will have to wait and watch. But right now, I don't see any meaningful threat. And like Max mentioned again, on the profitability side, it's at least I would say 18 months or maybe 3 to 5 years out. Actually, I would say. And it's really a function of building scale and negotiating less onerous royalty structure. Could happen sooner, but at this point, we see that it's at least a little ways out. Going to the next slide, slide number 11, it's a little deeper dive into the financials. In our model, we expect 25 million active users by the end of 2013. It was 24 million last reported as of March, but we've kind of taken a conservative approach. I mean, it could be much more than that, but we will wait and see. Additionally, we estimate that paid penetration will remain slightly above the 25% for the full year, so they're about 6 to 6.5 million. On the next point, we're expecting, like I mentioned, the 6 million paying subscribers in 2013, paying roughly $9.24 per month on average. And this is a mix between the premium and the free, the $10 and the $5 plans. So we think on average, that's the metrics that we are following. Additionally, we believe advertising revenue will ramp up based on their new partnerships. And so net, we expect revenues of roughly $1 billion in 2013 and reaching $1.4 billion in 2014, but profitability not before at least 2016 at the earliest. The next slide, slide 12, is the valuation. As you know, the company is not profitable. We tried many metrics, but ultimately we decided investors are probably looking at the public multiples out there of companies that are in streaming business or either music or other streaming businesses, so terrestrial or on demand or digital. So we kind of clubbed everything together and took a EV to revenue multiple. Based on that, the peer multiple is 3.9 times 2013 consensus. So extrapolating that to Spotify's $994 million in 2013 gives us an enterprise value of $3.8 billion. And we believe there's room for additional valuation upside. I mean, if they company can show more subscriber growth and increase advertisement sales. So I think there's definitely room for upside, but I think the base case, the fair value at this point is $3.8 billion. I will hand over to Max to kind of wrap up the winners and losers, and then we'll come back for Q&A.
Thank you. I'm going to try to go through this quickly because we've gotten quite a flood of questions. We appreciate all the inquiries, and we'll do our best with the time constraints to answer as many of these questions as we can. Just another quick mention to those out there who want to ask the question get it answered. The queue is getting fairly long, so please don't wait that much longer so that we can address as many of your questions as is humanly possible. So here we're trying to look at winners and losers, not just in the Spotify story, but in the streaming digital story writ large. There's a sort of obvious plays here. So the music service providers that can get the ad mixture of basic advertising and subscription right will be advantaged. We do think that's part of the reason we like Spotify, heavy reliance on subscription, recurring revenue that they have been able to grow, a very high conversion rate from free to paid, also key. Clearly, the closeness and the ability to negotiate good terms with the owners of the catalogs is absolutely essential. We see Apple as at least virally running a campaign about how well that's going, and certainly they do have deep and long-standing relationships based on past successes with the iPod and with iTunes, and so they're trying to leverage those. Clearly, this is a story of scale, as are most consumer-facing Internet Web 2.0 type firms. This is no exception. So obviously, the social will be key, and a broad geographic presence will be huge. To that list, we would add the telcos are also benefited because the data usage is very large when you're streaming music. This has been advantageous to some of the telco providers. Having so many people in this space has ironically held the price is fairly high on the royalty side. So folks who own particularly fairly universally popular music have found a highly lucrative whole new way of monetizing these catalogs. They are huge winners in the rise of digital, and we would look to them to continue to be really well advantaged by this. The mobile advertising community, we think, has also been advantaged. So much activity for streaming and mobile-based means lots and lots and lots of people trying to get those ad dollars. While there remain significant questions about the effectiveness of these ads, what it's really done is place a constant downward pressure on the basic price per engagement, price per impression. So folks who are good at leveraging the mobile music buy space really have a huge and growing audience that's accessible through these ads at an incredibly low price. We also think on a go-forward basis, Google and Apple will continue to be advantaged. Folks with a full mobile and or a full internet ecosystem don't want people to leave their ecosystem when they want to listen to music. And that means right now, Google, Apple, Facebook can keep you in there for the music portion of your life. You no longer have to leave the Apple universe, the Google universe, the Facebook universe in order to enjoy the social and mobile elements of music. We think that's fairly important. In terms of the losers, there's, again, the usual suspects. We think that the providers of ad-only revenue, those who either have a very low rate of converting to a subscription or who attempt to monetize freemium without a subscription that either works or exists at all, will be chipped away at by folks who can take lower rates, by the competition in the space, and by the difficulty of getting much in the way of a CPM rate from advertisers. We don't see that changing. Also, there's a technology situation here, and if you don't keep up with the service offerings and the various utilities and user experience, given the low barrier to entry, given the relative lack of real long-term relationship, it is a bit of a commodity service. If you fall behind in technology in this area, it could fairly quickly be fatal. To the obvious, we would add 3. Terrestrial radio continues to be pressured by the digital streaming experience. We think iTunes, which has really seen a reduction here, will continue to lose ground. Also, the iPod, still being sold, if not so much in the developed, but more in the developing world, will continue to have some difficulties here. We saw this maybe most pronounced first with YouTube, as young people stopped buying music and started basically listening to it on YouTube, dominant with teens. And we also think the free portion of the freemium and the popularity of these services will continue to make it less compelling for folks to buy and store MP3 tracks. Not great for the iPod, definitely not great for iTunes, further pressure in that space. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Santosh, and hopefully, despite our limited time, we'll be able to take at least some of what look to be quite a large number of no doubt vital questions.
Thanks, Max. In the interest of time, we'll probably take 1 or 2 questions. We have a whole bunch of questions. What I did was kind of consolidated most of them and narrowed it down to about 2 to 3 questions at this point. So the first question is, how does the rise of mobile affect all the players in the streaming music business? So that's a good question, very relevant question at this point, and I think it's very important for every company all of them to have a strong presence in the mobile space. Pandora has been doing that. It's been up and down, but they definitely have the initiatives in place to do that. Spotify has a strong presence in there. So I would say all of them have a presence, and if you don't, it's at your own risk. So I think net, I would say it's very important. I'm sure Max has a few things to say about that.
I mean, terrestrial radio's last great redoubt was folks in their car. So it's well known that ad premium, the most successful radio programming, tends to occur during what's called drive time, so early a.m. weekday and 5 to 7 p.m. weekdays. And the area that has been least affected by this has been the talk radio and the news programs, although we do see more content of that type coming a little bit to some of the streaming services. The problem being that the car was a captive audience for terrestrial radio, and increasingly we see penetration from streaming services. So Pandora with a large and increasing number of automotive tie-ins, Spotify following suit, and the mobile penetration, meaning that more and more people are doing this. The barrier, part of the reason we highlighted telcos being somewhat advantaged here, is that streaming over any longer period of time, music, requires an unlimited data package or puts you into a position where your data costs might be quite significant. This is also affecting the ramp up for the always streaming option in developing markets where data bandwidth and data cost can be a bit of an issue. But we do think mobile is going to be the platform for the future here. We definitely see movement off the desktop. We also feel that's the reason the subscription is so important, because the move from desktop to mobile, if you're using a subscriber base for revenue, is non-material. If you're ad-supported, you're losing 50+% of your ad dollars, dollars per ad, when you move to mobile.
Thank you, Max. The next question is, again, a very relevant one. It says, looks like the space is getting crowded with Jimmy Iovine of Beat Electronics and Google All Access a few weeks back, and Apple possibly in the future. How do you think Spotify will compete in this new competitive landscape? Well, I'll get started here. I think this was well known. I mean, all these players, like I said, the barriers to entry are pretty low in this business. Everyone has, the differentiation is very nil. So I think the key is going to be to have a strong social platform and provide good service, and of course have a broad collection at easy price points. And Spotify is hitting all those points. So at this point, I would say they have established themselves. They are a good competitor, and they are well positioned to compete with all these new entrants. So, Max, do you have any? Okay, Max. Let me go to the third question, and I think that's another relevant question. The relationship of Spotify with Facebook. What does it mean for Spotify, and what's the future here? So, I think, like I said in my presentation earlier, Spotify's relationship with Facebook was an absolute home run. It helped them launch in the U.S., and it has really helped them establish themselves here. And this business is inherently social. You need social kind of gives you the network effect that you need to keep your listeners on board. And no one better than Facebook to provide that platform. So I think the relationship with Facebook is a plus, and Spotify is doing well. One second, and Max has a few words to say about that.
Clearly part of the trepidation that informs some of the questions about, and we got quite a few here, about the relationship between Facebook and Spotify. We don't see the Spotify situation vis-a-vis Facebook as in any way akin to Zynga or particularly vulnerable. The Spotify offering helps to increase the amount of time people spend inside Facebook, and they really are quite accretive. So in order to get the higher-end Spotify service, you automatically have the tie-in with Facebook. in addition to which this allows the social overlay. And what it's really done is remind people of the Spotify option all the time, given the amount of time folks spend with some Facebook interactivity running on a passive level in the background. So we see this partnership as fairly stable and accretive. All that being said, anyone with a large social or large mobile presence can enter the space. And in the long term, the way we framed our discussion is to think about this a little bit the way the e-commerce portion of airline tickets evolved. Eventually, we'll probably see various organizations around which the owners of the catalog, and hopefully going forward some penetration for the artists here, will find multiple ways of using different distribution channel partners to monetize existing catalogs and emerging music. And there we also think that it's worth mentioning that the social discovery process is very valuable from a data perspective, and so Spotify also has real-time, interactive, always-on data insights into what people are listening to more, what people are listening to less, what people are more social and sharing that they listen to, and what different demographics and geographies are doing vis-a-vis music consumption patterns. And we see that as non-trivial. Yet again, this is something to be monetized, not at all monetized now, but we think they're building up a pretty interesting behavioral database that will be exciting to advertisers and accretive to the rising rev share we associate with advertising in the future.
All right, I think that was the last question. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This was a very interesting session, and please stay in touch with us. We will continue to have a number of webinars down the road, and we also provide independent research on a number of companies, so we have a lot of new ideas, so hope to stay in conversation with you down the road. So please do stay in touch. With that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you.